Ever stared at your test score knowing you're smarter than that number? It's frustrating. After analyzing thousands of test results, I've discovered something surprising. The highest scorers aren't just the ones who study the most. They've mastered what I call point capture, getting the points they deserve on questions they already know. Today, I'll show you 10 strategies to stop losing these points so you can score higher without having to study more, starting with your very next test. Strategy number 1 is a secret that professional gamblers and elite athletes both understand, that success isn't about being right or wrong. It's about playing the odds. In other words, you want to think like a professional card counter. In high school, I didn't do very well on standardized exams. I was rejected from all of my top choice colleges because I didn't do very well on the SATs. One of the major reasons for this was because I had the wrong mentality. I thought, well, I either know it or I don't. And if I get a question wrong, it just meant that I didn't know it. Instead, a better way of thinking about this is to think of your score as the sum of the expected outcomes on every single question. So what do I mean by this? In the NBA, basketball teams basically try to maximize the number of shots that they take at the three-point line and as layups. The reason why basketball teams do this is because they want to score the most points, right? And so the easiest way to score the most points is to consider the probability of making the shot, multiplying it by the value that that shot would have. Tests are basically no different. You want to maximize your chances of getting every single question correct. One of the major changes for me was, instead of thinking about it as like, oh, I either get the question right or wrong, I was thinking about it in terms of odds. For example, if I had no idea what the question was, I would have a 20% chance of getting that question correct. That would mean that the expected value from that question was only 0.2 points. But if I could go from 1 in 5 to 1 in 4 choices, then I could increase the expected value of that from 0.2 to 0.25. And then if I could eliminate another answer choice, I could increase the value of that question from 0.25 to 0.33. And then if I could eliminate another answer choice, I could go from 0.33 to 0.5. Every single time I was able to eliminate another answer choice, I could improve the likelihood of getting the questions correct. For me, this was an absolute game changer. Let me give you a thought experiment to show you how powerful this can be and how much of an impact this can have on your score. So let's say on a typical test, maybe 5% of the time, we have no idea what the answer is. So we've got like maybe 1 in 5 odds. Let's say that 5% of the time, we can maybe eliminate one really obvious answer that's wrong, and so we've got 1 in 4 odds. At least half of the time, we're between 1 in 3 choices or 1 in 2 choices. What would the impact be on your score if you could eliminate one extra answer choice on every single question? I did this for one of the medical board exams for the USMLEs and found that your score would go from 64%, which would be the 11th percentile, all the way to 83%, which would be the 75th percentile. To give you some context, for the SATs, the 11th percentile would be about 790, whereas the 75th percentile would be about a 1200. So in other words, you get more than a 400-point boost if you could just eliminate one extra answer choice in this scenario. For the MCAT, the 11th percentile is about a score of a 486, which is well below the level that it takes to get into medical school, whereas the 75th percentile corresponds to a score of about 508, which is close to the average for matriculants. What this means is that to improve your score, don't think about it as just like, oh, I either know this or I don't. Think about this like a professional card counter who's always trying to maximize the odds of winning, knowing that any outcome is possible for any particular question. Now that you understand how to think about questions probabilistically, strategy number 2 is one of the most powerful ways to improve those odds: understanding what the question is really testing. Imagine being able to turn seemingly impossible questions into familiar territory. That's exactly what happens when you learn to see through to what questions are really asking. This is critical because standardized exams typically are going to test the application of key concepts. Up to 70% of the questions are what they call applying foundational science concepts. On the MCAT, this is really common for topics like physics or chemistry. For example, questions that are about like a gun being fired from the ground 5 meters up, and they say like, how long does it take for the bullet to hit the ground? You can think about this either as a collection of details where you're just gonna have to memorize how it is that you'd solve it, or you can just take the principles of conservation of energy and remember how to convert potential to kinetic energy. Similarly, for the USMLEs, there was a question that I was going over with the student. What would you see on an echocardiogram for a massive blood clot that went into the lungs, which we call a pulmonary embolism? A first or second year medical student would struggle with this question if you asked it in that way, right? Because they didn't really understand what the question was asking. Instead, the question was really getting at a core concept. The concept was really just about resistance. Pulmonary embolism just represents resistance to blood flow. It's sort of as if I was gonna take a blood vessel and I was just gonna squeeze it. Really, the question is asking, like, if I squeeze the blood vessel, what would happen to all the blood coming from the heart that's trying to pump it into that blood vessel, right? If I break it down conceptually, it makes it a lot easier. And so if I ask it in that way, even with the same amount of knowledge, don't you think I could eliminate 1, 2, 3, or maybe even all 4 of the other answer choices that are incorrect? So how do you improve your ability to understand what the question is really asking you and dive beyond just the detail? First thing you want to do is to actually write down what you think the question is asking before you answer it. This is obviously something that you should practice in an untimed setting. If you're doing this timed, you can go back afterwards and write down what you think the question is asking. But ultimately what you want to do is you want to take your answer and then go and find someone who's really good at taking tests, who's really good at seeing the concepts behind the questions, and ask to compare their interpretation with yours. What you'll often find is that there's a big gap between what it is that you see in the question and what it is that they're seeing. This is a skill like anything else, and just like anything, you have to practice improving your ability to see the underlying concepts. The best way to do that is through having a natural feedback mechanism. You can compare yourself with a high performer. Strategy number 3 is the answer verification system. This is where you can stop anchoring and start analyzing questions. One of the most dangerous moments in test taking isn't when you don't know the answer. It's actually when you think that you do and you're wrong. A really common example is medical diagnosis questions for medical students. There was a student that I was working with, and they were reading a question where the patient was just coughing a lot. They immediately thought of acid reflux. That is one of the causes of coughing. And since this patient was coughing more at night, that is something that they thought like, well, that would make sense with acid reflux. That's fine. However, they happen to be wrong. It's okay if your initial idea is wrong. However, the problem comes when you stop considering alternatives, and that's what happened to her. There were a couple of clues that made it less likely that it was acid reflux and more likely that it was asthma, but because she'd already decided in her head like, oh yeah, this is acid reflux, she just kind of turned off her brain and didn't see all of the clues, even though she had all of the knowledge necessary to get this question correct. You might see this on the MCAT and say like a physics problem. If you see like circular motion, you might immediately think of centripetal force or another question that you saw that was similar to this, but you might miss that the question is actually asking you something else, like maybe about conservation of energy or some other topic. In the book, Thinking Fast and Slow by Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, he talks about how our minds just throw out ideas at us without us really thinking about it. Unless you take a step back and really evaluate it using what he calls the system 2, your system 1 or automatic thinking brain will take over. And this is exactly the kind of mistake that can prevent you from getting questions correct that you have the knowledge already for. So how can you solve this? This is what we call the rule in before ruling out method. The way to do this is that you want to force yourself to find evidence for each option first before you eliminate it. To do this, ask yourself, what would make this answer right? Question of asthma, what most people would do, they get to asthma and they say, well, this isn't asthma because, and then they'll make up some kind of reason just to justify why they think it's something else. The better approach is to look at asthma among the answer choices and say, what elements of this would support asthma as the answer choice? And you might say something like, well, asthma would give me an increase in coughing at night, and it also wouldn't be positional. Asking yourself to justify why the answer would be right before you try to eliminate it can have a dramatic impact because it'll already spark your brain to start thinking about, okay, well, maybe this is right. This is also a really effective way for you to learn how to eliminate other answer choices because it's going to force you to give more justifications and specific evidence rather than just relying on gut feelings. I can't tell you how many times I talk to students who are just like, well, I don't know, it just kind of like feels right. And feelings can be okay, right? But it's much better. You'll have a much more reliable way of getting questions correct if you have a system of thinking through why some answers are right and some answers are wrong. Now that you have a system for verifying your answers, let's talk about how to maintain the mental energy necessary to apply this technique throughout your entire test. Strategy number 4 is mental energy management with mindfulness. So the stereotype that I always had of mindfulness meditation and meditation more broadly was that most people just think that it's about, oh, I just need to like concentrate more, I need to work on my focus. Or they would say things like, oh, I have to be present and think about my breathing. And like, I had a really hard time with that, honestly. As someone who has ADHD, my mind tends to flit among topics much faster. It was very, very difficult for me to learn meditation until I learned this one thing. What someone taught me about meditation in general, and mindfulness specifically, was that it's not about having perfect concentration. Instead, it's about recognizing that your mind is going to wander naturally and learning how to recognize that faster and bring it back to what it is that you're doing more quickly. If you think about it, this can solve the really, really common problem that I have struggled with my entire life with test taking, where I'll read something and then I'll read a paragraph and I'll get to maybe the middle or the end of the paragraph and I'll ask myself like, what did that actually just say? And I'll have to go back and reread it because I wasn't paying attention the first time. For me, mindfulness meditation was the perfect cure for this because it helped me to recognize that my mind was wandering and then helped me to bring it back faster, which is exactly what I needed in a timed high-stakes exam. In order to implement this, what I recommend to all students that I work with is to plan on a 60-minute body scan exercise every night. And so a body scan exercise is basically where you'll use some kind of guided meditation where you put your attention in different parts of your body. So it might say like, you're gonna focus on your breathing first, and then it'll say something like, put your awareness in your foot or your ankle or things like that. The point of meditation, at least in my experience, is that you're learning to bring your attention to something that you always have, like your breathing or the fact, like awareness of different parts of your body. Practicing that in a dedicated fashion allows you to bring that ability to your everyday life, including your exam. The reason why I recommend doing this at night is because it's very relaxing. And so basically one of two things will typically happen. Either A, I will fall asleep, which is great. Or B, I'll actually be able to do the body scan exercise for 30 or 60 minutes and really improve my ability to concentrate. And so now that you can manage your mental energy, let's talk about managing the emotional pressure that can drain it. Strategy number 5 is all about anxiety management. Because here's the truth about test anxiety. It's not really about eliminating it. It's about breaking the cycle of overwhelming thoughts that can derail you on test day. What can really derail people on an exam is when they start to have panic. The only times that I've ever seen people vastly underperform their practice test scores, two reasons. One is because they panicked, or two is because they were really, really burned out. So let's talk about how to reduce that panic. One of the things that I found that's most useful for me to reduce my level of panic is to actually consider my worst case scenario and take it to its conclusion. One technique that's been found to be very effective, particularly for very strong emotions, is what they call affect labeling. Affect labeling is sometimes known as you gotta name it to tame it. The idea here is that you wanna name your emotions whenever anxiety hits. I'm feeling really anxious about my exam because I really, really wanna do well. And I wanna do well because I wanna get into a really good medical school. This allows you to name the emotion and understand what the cause of it might be. After that, you want to then focus on separating your feelings from your action. It makes sense that I feel really anxious about this. However, I can still choose to be present. Studies have shown that just naming your feelings, particularly the really, really strong feelings, can immediately help you to start calming yourself. And with your mind clear and emotions steady, let's talk about the simple timing rule that can transform your performance even further. Strategy number 6 is what I call the 30-second rule. If you're struggling with timing, the biggest mistake that you're making isn't reading too slowly. Instead, it's getting stuck on hard questions. This is how to stop that forever. The 30-second rule goes like this. You want to never spend more than 30 seconds extra per question. So for example, if you've got 60 questions and you've got 60 minutes to do them in, then you would never want to spend more than 90 seconds on any one question. If you've got 40 questions and you've got 60 minutes, each of those questions is allotted for 1.5 minutes. You would never want to spend more than 2 minutes on each of the questions. If you get to the end of the task and you have extra time and you want to go back over it, that's totally fine. But when you're first going through the question, never spend more time. So the reason why this works is that when you actually sit down and analyze why people struggle with timing, the vast majority of cases come from perseverating on a handful of questions for too long. Those questions that you spend so much time on, the percentage likelihood of getting those questions correct is really, really low. So for example, a common thing that I'll see is that, maybe in a block of questions where someone got 80% of the questions correct, for all the questions that they spent more than 2 minutes on, they got maybe 50% of those questions correct, right? What that implies is that spending more time on those questions didn't actually help improve your accuracy. These are also the same people who are getting questions wrong because they don't have enough time to answer them at the end of the block. Instead, by making sure that you never spend too much time on any one question, you can ensure that you have enough time for all of the remaining questions. This was a big eye-opener for me because I always thought like, oh, okay, well, I'm struggling with questions because I'm a slow reader. Instead, what I realized when I actually looked at my and others' behavior was that my timing problems came because of a disproportionate amount of time that I was spending on the question that I probably wasn't gonna get right anyways. So now that you know how to manage your time, let's talk about making the most of your first reading. While perseverating on questions can kill your timing, the issue that will slow you down and kill your score is reading without context. This brings us to strategy number 7, which is to move beyond buzzwords. Oftentimes on exams that are written by professors, like either in high school or in college or in medical school, you can scan it and look for buzzwords. And typically, if you find the right keyword, then you know that that is the right answer, or at least it's pretty close. For standardized exams like the SATs, and in particular the MCAT and the USMLEs, context is everything. It's really, really important that you don't just scan and look for buzzwords, but you actually are able to think about what every sentence means relative to each other. So for medicine, for example, there are very, very few signs or symptoms of a condition that by itself is diagnostic. For a pulmonary embolism, which is where you have a blood clot that goes to your lungs, there are multiple different factors that can lead to this condition. So for example, one of them is like if you're a smoker. Smoking in and of itself could mean lots and lots of things. So if they give you a vignette which talks about smoking, the first thing that you're thinking about is probably not a pulmonary embolism. Instead, it'll probably be something like COPD. Similarly, if a vignette tells you that someone was hospitalized recently, it might make you think by itself that, oh, okay, they were exposed to, drug-resistant bacteria. Finally, let's say that someone is taking birth controls. There's a lot of different things, you might not think anything about birth control. However, when you put all three of those things together and you consider the context of, okay, so there's a smoker who is recently hospitalized and is taking birth control pills, that dramatically increases your risk of having a pulmonary embolism. The issue that I see with test takers is that oftentimes they're so focused on just looking at that one sentence by itself that they're not asking the critical question of what does this actually mean in context? Instead, after every single time you read a sentence, just ask yourself, okay, what does this mean relative to the other sentences? Because it's only when you see all those pieces together that you're actually able to understand the underlying medical condition. This brings us to strategy number 8, which is the pattern recognition and seeing the question behind the question. Elite test takers don't just answer questions, they recognize the patterns that reveal what's really being tested. The SAT verbal section has a lot of really powerful examples of the different kinds of patterns that you can see. Once you see these patterns, it's a lot easier to understand what it is that they're asking and what the correct answer would be. For example, the first time that you see parrot is to bird, you might be like, oh, I don't know, let's see what the other things are talking about. The kind of question that this is specific to general, meaning like, okay, green is to color, or fork is to utensil, or oak is to tree, right? Once you see that, it becomes a lot easier to pick out the correct answer as well. The best test takers and the people that are scoring the highest are the ones who are able to look at a question and peel back the layers and see the pattern behind it. This is true across the MCAT and the USMLEs, the SATs, and really any standardized test that you're taking. Strategy number 9 is spaced repetition, which is the ultimate study hack. A painful truth that I learned in medical school was that I didn't have to study more in order to learn more. The key is that I just had to forget a lot less. I've talked a lot about spaced repetition and the powers of this in the past, and some of you may be aware of Anki or other sorts of programs that help you to use flashcards to retain information more efficiently. In my case, over the last 15 plus years, I've made over 20,000 flashcards that have helped me to understand things more deeply and make more connections. Because of the power of spaced repetition, I only have to study 20 to 30 minutes to remember all of that information. This includes most of the things that I found important at Stanford when I was a medical student, all the things that I made flashcards on during residency when I was at Harvard MGH, and everything that I've made flashcards on since then. It's a lot easier to just make sure that you don't forget things that you've learned rather than have to constantly go back and relearn it. And you'll save a ton of time in your studying if you can just plug the holes in what we call the leaky bucket, where instead of just constantly pouring knowledge into your bucket as it's leaking out, if you plug those holes, there's really no limit to how much you can learn. This is one of the major hacks that I've learned in order to improve test scores, especially for things that require a lot of knowledge, like say the verbal section on the SATs, or biology on the MCAT, or really most of the USMLE content. Strategy number 10 is strategic break management. Now, this is less relevant for the SATs and the MCAT where you can't choose your breaks, but for the exams that you can choose your breaks, like the USMLEs, when you choose to use your break time and how much break time to use is critical. The key things to note are that break time becomes more valuable the later you are in your test. The other thing to note is that oftentimes for the USMLEs, your check-in and check-out times can be unpredictable. I knew one person where they were taking their test, but the fingerprint scanner was broken in the test center. And so because of that, it took like 5 times as long for people to get in and out. And so he had decided to take a break between his first and second sections because that was what he had done previously. And he came back to his seat and found that he had used like 20 minutes of his 60 minutes of break time. So he had used a third of his break time. With that in mind, I typically recommend taking a break only after your second block if you're taking the USMLEs. I've included the broader strategy here. What I will note is that you can actually have what I call a sit-in break, which means you don't have to check out and check in on your exam. You can actually just click that you want to take a break and then just stay in your seat. That way you can just take like a minute or two to compose yourself and then jump into your next block. Hopefully you realize that you already know more than you think. Start using these techniques on your next practice test to get the points you deserve. Want more? Check out how I scored in the top 1% on the hardest exams in the world.